The Caine survival tool has a bit of an interesting history. Lofty Wiseman, who has a history with Caine, has a very similar knife, and they're both modern versions of essentially parangs. Now there are some similarities and differences between the Caine and Lofty Wiseman tools and actual parangs. The biggest difference between the Caine version and a traditional parang is the use of a rather heavy saber grind and full tang construction, which make a pretty large difference between how this handles and cuts compared to a traditional parang. Now on small diameter, relatively thin scrap, it works really well. And it's one of the knives that I like the most for doing this type of work. It has a lot of weight, hits rather hard, doesn't bind very much, and is very stiff and strong, so you can easily pry and bust wood apart when you need to. And it even has the raw weight and power just to smash nails out of the way, bend them in, and pry apart old scrap with no fear of even flexing significantly, let alone having any chance of sort of bending it to failure. So much better than a light machete for this type of work. However, when you move to light vegetation, you get sort of the exact opposite. The survival tool can do it. One of the things you need to make absolutely sure is that the edge is very sharp, otherwise you won't cut light vegetation very well at all. Now, it can do it, and in fact the nice sweep it has before it enters the main belly catches the vegetation very well. But doing this work with the Caine survival tool and then doing it something with the light machete from Jeff Randall, it's night and day. The Caine survival tool is much heavier, and right there where I'm doing little tiny pitter patter chops, I'm trying to avoid smashing the edge violently into the ground because the edge is very rocky there. But the SA Light Machete will cut this stuff much better. It's much lighter in hand and much lighter to carry. So you're just doing a lot more work with the Caine survival tool to get the same amount of cutting done. But yes, it can do it. So it is fairly versatile in that regard. And then you can see the hook there. Basically what I'm doing is I'm entering into the cut below the sweep, so the vegetation has a sort of crawl above the sweep, which enhances the cutting ability and will keep the blade cutting even after it has dulled significantly where it would have slipped off the belly. By making it crawl up that sort of recurve, you can keep it cutting for longer. Now when I'm doing a lot of this work here, again I'm trying to be a bit precise. These are just some branches that are extending over now or into the driveway. So I'm not cutting this tree down, and I'm trying to be just trim these branches off as precise as possible, not just crudely limbing out this tree. And the raw weight and power of the Caine survival tool is a bit of a detractor here. Because again, you're only wanting to do little tiny chops, sort of precisely get rid of these limbs. And on grasses and green and light vegetation, you don't need the raw mass and the weight and the power anymore. And if anything, you're sort of fighting against it. But you can still do the work, and it's far more effective than trying to use something, obviously, like a small hatchet. So the versatility of a longer blade and being able to chop heavier wood and still do this type of wood is striking. When you do a fair amount of it together. Now cutting up a lot of these old branches that you get from when you clear up that kind of brush, again it works very well. And very similar to when I was using the gigantic cleaver, because this is a heavier blade, you want to do sort of slower chops, and mainly what you're doing is just trying to cut through the wood. If you put more power than that, you'll drive it through the wood and into the block, and then you're putting too much power to do the cut. You're having to try to pop it out of the block. You're wasting a lot of energy. It's an interesting toss-up whether or not I'd want to use this or the SE Light Machete for this type of work. The SE is more of a speed-based chop, and it takes me a bit of time to to get into whichever one that I'm using, because if you swing the SA machete a little too fast, it'll dig into the wood, so you're trying to get that exact balance of speed. Whereas with the Caine survival tool, it's more about how much power you put into the cut on the end. So essentially with both you're trying to achieve the same thing, but the swings are a little different. So if you want a bit of an interesting sort of little experiment, keep swapping back and forth from one to the other and trying to find the exact balance, because the swings are so different between one and the other. It can be a little bit interesting to see if you can optimize both of them and be consistent at the same time. But again, very nice blade for this. The heavier grind on this, because it's a saber grind, does make it nice and fluid. There's no issues with sticking, and it's very easy to get this to work through the wood with no problems with binding or wedging. Again, this is a very soft wood. Most of it is alder, and alder is even softer generally, or in the same class as clear open grain white pine. So it's a rather soft wood. So this type of work is where the Caine survival tool sort of moves into the awkward range. I'm at a local grave site, and I'm trying to get some alders that have grown from both sides of the fence and just clear it up a little bit. The problem is here is that this area, not only do I have to avoid chopping into the fence and the posts, but this area is full of rocks and garbage. So what I'm having to do is sort of clear it away, expose the shoots, and sort of chop them very lightly and sort of separate them off. The actual raw power, the mass, which was helping me when I was doing a lot of the other work, is hindering me now, because I'm actually having to fight against that and try to do less than full power chops. Because full power chops not only will cut through this wood, they'll drive the blade right into the soil. So ideally for this, I'd want a much lighter blade, a much smaller blade. Something like the SE Light Machete would be decent, but what would be almost ideal would be something like the Cold Steel Bushman series, which has just enough chopping ability to cut through these sticks without power chopping them right directly into the ground. And of course is also much lighter and shorter, so it's easier to carry and easier to work with. And on blades like that, some of this could be done simply by actual push cutting and wouldn't even need to be chopping. And in some places, like I said, I'm trying to also not cut down some of the evergreen trees, although I think that one's going to have to go because it's too close to the fence. So I think for this work, I'd actually prefer a small axe than the hatchet specifically, rather than the Caine survival tool. Because if I choked up right underneath the head on the axe, I could neutralize a lot of the weight and make it more neutral balanced, and then get easier to get much lighter chops. But again, this blade is rather versatile, but you just want to spend some bit of time to learn how to use it effectively. But the other thing is, as careful as you are, as careful as I am here, and I'd probably take about 2 to 3 times as long to do this as if I was using with reckless abandon and just chopping rather heavily. Even then, as precise as I am, as controlled as I am, I'm still chopping into the ground on occasion. And I flattened the edge back from contacts with rocks in a number of areas. But the edge just again gets flattened back. The steel is nice and durable. There's no heavy chipping. There's no heavy impaction. So that will just gradually go away with repeated sharpening and chopping and such. This is a bullet from Des Horn, small folder in Nitrobe 77, sort of presentation grade class. You don't, of course, need to use something as large and heavy as the Caine survival tool to do this type of work. Here I am again now doing the same type of work almost in the same area, where I'm again trimming some growth back that is growing into the surrounding fencing. Now, as Cody London is fond of pointing out, you don't need big heavy machetes to cut wood. You can even cut wood of rather significant size by just bending it, putting it under tension, and slicing it with a knife. The bullet is a gentleman folder, ground very thin, and easily handles this type of work. And the nice thing about Nitro 77 and low carbide steels in general is that they're exceptionally tough and durable. And this has a high hardness, so it resists impaction, because I'm again scraping this into rocks, not chopping it, but it's still making contact with rocks. But the high hardness prevents it from getting significant denting or impaction, and a very high toughness for a stainless steel, because it's relatively low carbide, means that there's no chipping or any kind of fracture. And I can easily take this and get rid of all this vegetation in just a few minutes. Now, it would be faster with a decent machete, ideally a blade that you didn't care about whatsoever and you were willing to use up rather quickly, and just chop rather heavily and hit the rocks, hit whatever was in the way, and then just resharpen out as needed. But if you're willing to take, about twice as long and sort of get down close to it, you can do a lot of this work with smaller blades as well. Here's another small blade, again doing similar work, cleaning up some alders, this time from my backyard that are sort of growing in again. This is a Canadian from Udo. It's a custom knife maker, does some rather interesting work with epoxy based handles and handle extensions with commonly a little loop of paracord. And I'm actually using the handle extension here to very good effect. It's my pinky is in through the loop down at the end. And again, very easy to take the little blade and cut through this wood. And again, this part of the video is accelerated. What I'm doing is cleaning up some alders that are growing around some evergreens, and I just want to open them up. And this would be rather awkward with something like the Caine survival tool, because it would be very difficult to cut the alders without chopping into the evergreens. But with a smaller blade, easier to do the sort of surgical type work. Now, in terms of raw power, this doesn't get up to the same kind of penetration class as the other larger blades in the same mass range that I've used in this series. And the reason why it does is basically two main factors. Number one, it has a saber grind. Now, the penetration is rather low here, I should say, because I'm picking some heavy knotted sections of the wood. Just want to give another run to make sure that the edge durability is where I want it to be. Again, because this is a heavier sort of ground blade, I use it for heavier type work. So anyway, the reason why the penetration is a bit lower than some of those other blades is because of two main reasons. The first one is that it is a saber grind, so it has a lot more thickness in the blade than a flat ground blade or a very low convex ground blade of the same thickness. The other thing is that the mass distribution isn't ideal. It has a full tang, which is sort of became the rage in the late 90s and still continues to today. And people think that's necessary for durability for some odd reason. It's very difficult to actually load the handle, and especially the end of the tang, with any kind of strain unless you're doing something weird like hanging off the very end of the handle. So all that extra weight in the handle doesn't really go into the cut. It's very difficult to put it into it, so it's just dead weight in the hand and dead weight when you're swinging it, which is why native parangs have very slender tangs and the weight is up front, so you get more power per weight essentially. Now the other thing is with a full height grind, you get more cutting ability per weight, and when you combine the two of them, you can get a rather striking effect. So when I was cutting the 2x2 For example, something like the Excalibur can easily do that in 3 hits and often does it in as little as 1. This does it in 3 hits on, a good piece of wood, and it does it on 5 hits on average. So it's a clear step behind blades like the Excalibur, and it's mainly because of the heavier primary grind and a lot of weight there in the tang. But there is advantages to this as well, and I use it for completely different things. So when I have to process a lot of rotted wood, punky wood, or very, very soft open grain wood, I'll use the Caine survival tool over something like Mike's Excalibur, because Mike's Excalibur will start to over penetrate then, and I'll have issues with binding and wedging, and the Caine survival tool will stay and be a bit more fluid. So, as with all blades, it's about not just knowing their strengths and weaknesses, but how to use them to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. So a friend of mine had a lend of this and decided to see what would happen if he left it out overnight. I don't always give friends a full information on tools, and sometimes I do a little bit of experimentation. He was curious to see how stainless this would be. It's not. It's a plain carbon steel, so it rusts extremely easy. It's about as fast as any steel is going to rust. Interestingly enough, the liners absorbed water horrendously and all protruded from the handle and became very abrasive, but after a couple of days, the water came out of it, and they went back to being decently flush. That was kind of interesting. This is again only very mild surface rust, and it only took me about 30 seconds with just a regular kitchen scrub pad to knock all that scale off, and then you just end up with a sort of chicken pot type experience where you have all the little black dots left on it, but no harm, no foul done.